General Zix stood tall in the center of the Galactic Council chamber, his voice echoing with disdain as he declared that humans would cower at the first sight of battle. The murmurs of agreement and amusement among the alien delegates only reinforced the long-held belief that Earth's inhabitants were soft, peacebound beings, unprepared for the harsh reality of galactic warfare. The chamber itself pulsed with the energy of superiority and certainty that humans had no place on the battlefield. Zix's confidence was not unique. It was the shared mindset of an entire interstellar alliance that had long judged military value by physical prowess and technological enhancement. In this room filled with towering armored species with claws, scales, and natural defense mechanisms, the sight of humans arriving unarmored and seemingly fragile only confirmed their bias to them. Humans were an evolutionary misstep, creatures of diplomacy and caution, not warriors suited for the horrors of war, as Zix scoffed at. The human delegation, many others chuckled under their breath, viewing the moment as another inevitable example of Earth's irrelevance. The humans stood still, quiet, unmoved by the condescension. Their expressions unreadable among them was Lieutenant Mason Cole, who, despite being the center of ridicule, maintained a calm demeanor, one that clashed deeply with the narrative the Council had crafted for his kind. The aliens expected hesitation, fear, perhaps even a request to withdraw from the conflict. Instead, they were met with silence and eyes that scanned the room. Not with desperation, but with purpose. The assumptions were clear in the Council's reaction. They expected weakness. They expected trembling voices and desperate pleas, not steady gazes and composed postures in their minds. The humans were nothing more than flesh and bone, without the reinforced skeletons of the Gran or the reactive defense mechanisms of the Zarath, without natural armor toxins or claws, without even the telepathic shielding of the psychic races. Earthlings were viewed as the most biologically exposed species to ever step into a war zone, and yet here they were standing among those who had fought for centuries as if they belonged. The arrogance of the Council was not born of malice but tradition. Centuries of battles had hardened their views, and victories had cemented their hierarchies. They believed power was inherited through physiology and dominance was maintained through intimidation. So when the humans entered the chamber unfazed and silent, the reaction was not concern but mockery to them. This was just another doomed expedition from a backward planet whose people would learn the true meaning of warfare. Too late, as the moment stretched on, Zix's irritation grew, not because of any actual threat the humans posed, but because of their refusal to conform to expectations. Their silence was unnerving, their stillness almost defiant. They did not flinch or stammer. They did not protest or posture. They simply stood and waited. The Council interpreted it as ignorance, a lack of awareness about the scale of the threat they were about to face. But there was something deeper, something none of the aliens present could quite name, a presence that didn't fit the mold, a steadiness that made the sneers feel hollow. The assumptions began to feel fragile, as if hanging on outdated legends the humans had yet to speak. But already they had disrupted the natural order of the Council chamber. Their very existence was a contradiction to everything the galactic races had believed about survival and strength. Zix tried to reassert control, emphasizing the brutality of the Drawn and the futility of resisting them. He spoke of numbers, firepower, and history. He reminded the chamber that even the Fawns had withdrawn after a single clash with the Drawn, and yet the humans remained silent, still observing. Calculating the moment was no longer a spectacle of superiority. It had shifted into something subtler, something uneasy, as if the Council itself began to question whether their assumptions were as unshakable as they once thought. But pride runs deep and tradition even deeper. So the alien leaders clung to their narrative, masking their doubt with laughter and disbelief. Zix narrowed his eyes, scales darkening, as he challenged the humans once more, demanding to know what made them believe they could succeed where others had failed. The silence finally broke, and Lieutenant Cole answered, not with bravado, but with calm certainty, "We've done our homework." He said it was a simple statement, but one that landed with surprising weight. It implied preparation, planning knowledge, none of which fit the image of a naive species stumbling into conflict. It was the first crack in the Council's confidence, a signal that maybe, just maybe, they had underestimated something not yet visible. The chamber quieted slightly, just enough to register the shift in tone, but not enough to change the course of the conversation. The Council still believed they held the upper hand. They saw the humans as bold but ultimately doomed to fleeting curiosity in the long and bloody saga of galactic conflict. As the meeting drew on, that belief would be tested. But for now, in this opening moment of judgment or an arrogance, it was clear the Galactic Council saw humanity as weak, expendable, and wholly unfit for the war ahead. Lieutenant Mason Cole stood at the front of the human delegation, his expression unreadable as the Council's amused murmurs echoed through the grand chamber. The assumptions of weakness, cowardice, and naivety filled the air. Yet none of those reactions seemed to affect him. His posture remained relaxed, his eyes steady, and when he finally spoke, his words were not defensive or emotional, but calm and confident, overwhelming. "You're talking about facing off against the Drawn Empire," he said with a tone so casual it almost felt disrespectful to the aliens who had lost so much fighting. That enemy, the reaction was immediate. General Zix's scales rippled with visible irritation, turning a deeper shade of violet, a clear sign of his agitation, as he reminded the room of the Drawn's brutality, their relentless nature, and their history of demolishing entire species in a single campaign. He went so far as to mention the Fons who had withdrawn after just one battle with them, and then questioned how humans who lacked natural armor or deadly biological traits could possibly fare any better. The Council waited for the human to shrink back, to admit doubt or at least show some sign of nervousness. But instead, Cole paused and looked around the chamber as if he were evaluating, not pleading, not boasting, just quietly calculating. Then he said, "We've done our homework and we've handled worse." The words landed with a dull thud against the ornate walls of the Council chamber, followed by a soft rustle of laughter from the delegates who still found the idea of Earthlings going up against the Drawn absurd to them. The Drawn were not just enemies, they were nightmares, hardened warriors bred for war. Their weapons were superior, their numbers overwhelming, their tactics ruthless and efficient. The idea that a species like humanity, which lacked even the most basic galactic enhancements, could match them was more than laughable. It was insulting, but Cole remained unfazed, and when asked about their plans, he responded without a hint of doubt. "We'll start by sending a small squad. We like to make sure we understand our opponents before we go all in." It was a strategy that baffled the Council, who were used to overwhelming shows of force and immediate retaliation. One of the alien counselors, Breen, even commented that such a tactic sounded like a recipe for a massacre. But Cole's response again carried that same steady tone. "The difference between us and most of the Council here is we don't charge into battles blind, but when the time comes, we do go all in, and we don't hold back." His words hung in the air longer than anyone expected, creating a tension that neither mockery nor condescension could fully dispel. The arrogance in the room began to shift into something else, something less certain. The Galactic Council had rarely seen this kind of quiet resolve. It was unfamiliar and therefore unsettling. It wasn't just Cole either. Captain Eli Brooks stepped forward next, and his voice carried that same note of calm warning. "The Drawn haven't faced human warfare yet," he said. "You're about to witness tactics unlike anything you've seen." Before again there was laughter from some corners of the room, but it was quieter this time, less confident. The humans weren't begging for support or offering promises they couldn't keep. They were simply stating facts in a way that sounded almost casual, and that made it harder to dismiss. General Zix exchanged looks with Counselor Breen, both still holding on to their belief in the superiority of their alliances. But beneath the surface there was a flicker of uncertainty. The humans spoke of strategy, not power of preparation, not pride. And that difference, however subtle, began to tug at the edges of the Council's perception. The humans were not here to posture or impress. They were here to act, and that intent came through in their every word. Captain Brooks ended the meeting with a statement that lingered in every delegate's mind. "In about 3 days, you'll hear back from our squad, And when we've got the lay of the land, we'll show you why humans don't back down when it counts. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even bravado. It was a promise one made without fanfare or flourish. Just quiet certainty as the humans exited the council chamber. Their footsteps echoed against the marble floor, louder than the final words spoken. Their backs straight, their pace calm, their faces unreadable. The council members sat still watching them go, and for the first time since this conflict began, they felt something they hadn't associated with humans before. Not pity, not scorn, but a strange growing curiosity because, while the humans had no claws, no armor, no psychic strength to speak of, they had something else, and whatever it was strong enough to silence an entire chamber of war-hardened leaders, even if they weren't ready to admit it. Yet the moment was already shifting, and the first seed of doubt had been planted deep within the heart of the Galactic Council. 3 days after the council chamber meeting, the Galactic Council received a broadcast that none of them expected. The message came through calmly. And clearly, this is Lieutenant Cole reporting from the outpost. The aliens had assumed the humans had either retreated or been annihilated. But now there was Cole looking a bit dusty but very much alive, standing in front of a functioning communication relay. He didn't sound desperate, didn't beg for reinforcements or report mass casualties. Instead, he calmly explained that their initial assessments had been accurate, that the drawn forces were clustered around their supply depots, and more importantly, that they had never faced guerrilla tactics before. General Zix sat motionless, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. He repeated the term guerrilla tactics aloud, as if trying to confirm he'd heard correctly, and Cole confirmed, "Yes, sir. We've been moving in smaller units, destabilizing their supply lines, cutting off reinforcements. They're not responding well." The shock in the room was palpable. The drawn had the advantage in numbers, in artillery, and hardened experience. And yet here were humans casually dismantling their structure without losing a single soldier. When asked how many of their forces had been lost, Cole simply said, "Lost none, General, but the drawn have lost quite a few." Zix's jaw tightened as disbelief rippled through his thoughts. Their command structure is surprisingly brittle. Once you get under their exoskeletons, so to speak, Cole added. And with that, the screen blinked off, leaving the general staring at his own reflection, trying to grasp how this supposedly primitive species had just turned the tide without deploying a single ship from the fleet. The council scrambled an emergency meeting, pulling up streams of data, tactical logs, visuals, and engagement reports, all confirming the same impossible truth. The drawn front line was failing, and it wasn't through brute force or advanced technology. It was through surgical strikes and tactical maneuvering that humans were trained in techniques that bypassed strength and exploited structure. The council. Delegates watched footage of humans coordinating silently in the field, using hand signals, working in teams, laying traps, diverting enemy movement, and ambushing reinforcements with impeccable timing. They moved through terrain like shadows, vanishing and reappearing as needed, always striking where the drawn least expected. Captain Brooks soon followed with a second report, his voice clear. His tone matter-of-fact. The drawn aren't big on adaptability. He said they've got a rigid hierarchy, and once we started dismantling their chain of command, the rest fell apart pretty quickly. He gestured at the smoking ruins behind him. Remnants of a drawn fortification, cracked armor scattered across the ground. Turns out they rely heavily on centralized orders, and without those they crumble. Brooks's words landed like a hammer on the pride of the council counselor. Breen leaned forward, her silver eyes fixated on the tactical overlays as she whispered, "They have no psychic shields, no advanced weaponry. They're using kinetic projectiles and basic explosives, and it's working." She didn't understand how that was possible. The footage showed humans in standard body armor, nothing close to the protective gear. Other species were moving quickly, using the environment to their advantage, coordinating with a discipline that made up for every technological gap. Breen zoomed in on a soldier, directing his squad with 2 fingers, a short, sharp hand motion, before diving behind cover and letting out a controlled burst of fire. It was not reckless, it was not desperate, it was professional. "This makes no sense," she said again. But the evidence kept mounting. Captain Brooks explained that they had studied enemy movements, learned how the drawn deployed, how they replenished their forces and where the weaknesses lay, and then they struck not in waves but in pulses, coordinated, precise, devastating. Counselor Breen asked how many soldiers were in the battalion he'd just taken out. Brooks simply shrugged. Not many, he said, just enough to get the job done. The room was quiet, no longer amused or dismissive, but stunned by what they were witnessing. General Zix finally found his voice, demanding to know how such basic gear could possibly withstand drawn weaponry, and Brooks answered with a calmness that struck harder than any boast. Sometimes it's not the gear that matters most. It's the person using it. And with that, the screen cut out again. The council sat in silence, processing what they'd seen. The humans weren't winning. Because of superior firepower or larger numbers, they were winning. Because of how they thought, how they planned, and how they fought. The Drawn's brutal approach had never accounted for this kind of warfare. They expected resistance, not misdirection, not sabotage, not silent infiltration. They had been preparing for overwhelming force, not a shadow war, and the humans had turned every expectation into a weapon. The Council's pride was wounded, but more than that, their sense of security was shaken. This sun and species they had mocked days ago had now demonstrated a level of tactical excellence they had never encountered before. They moved like ghosts, fought like tacticians, and adapted faster than any species the Council had ever worked with. And for the first time since the war began, the question shifted from how long could humans survive to how far could they go. If this was just the beginning, what would they accomplish next? 3 hours after Lieutenant Cole's unexpected transmission, the Galactic Council assembled once again, but this time the energy in the chamber was no longer amused or dismissive. It was tense. Data feeds scrolled across the holoscreens, showing detailed reports of human engagements. Every statistic, every visual pointed to the same conclusion: the humans were not just surviving, they were dominating. Tactical maps lit up with red zones, once held by the Drawn, now taken by human squads. Footage played of Drawn forces being isolated, ambushed, and dismantled, piece by piece. General Zix sat frozen in his seat, his claws digging into the polished table as his mind reeled from the implications. Counselor Breen beside him leaned forward, studying the feeds, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. The humans are destabilizing entire Drawn battalions with minimal manpower. She muttered, her voice edged with awe. They're using tactics we haven't even considered. The visuals showed human soldiers moving through dense terrain, disappearing into foliage, setting traps and intercepting reinforcements. With a level of coordination that was almost surgical, they were working in units so small they should have been insignificant. Yet the results were anything but. The Drawn, known for their overwhelming force, were being picked apart like prey caught off guard, unable to adapt to the new kind of warfare. Breen watched as a Drawn squad was led into a narrow ravine where trip lines triggered directional charges and forced them into crossfire. They're fighting like this is their own territory, Shiwari whispered. Zix said nothing, but his face was a mask of growing realization. The humans were using the terrain in ways no other species did, turning forests, rocks, elevation, and visibility into weapons. They weren't fighting with brute strength, but with adaptation and control. Brooks appeared again on the central screen, his expression calm. Behind him, smoke curled from shattered Drawn fortifications. The area around him looked like it had been reclaimed, not just conquered. General Zix leaned forward, demanding an explanation. Brooks replied, matter-of-factly, the Drawn depend on orders. Without them, they fall apart. Once we started disrupting that structure, they didn't know how to respond. They rely on discipline and force, not flexibility. Counselor Breen cut in, still visibly shaken. You destabilized an entire Drawn front line with what Brooks simply said, a handful of troops, and added, we've had some practice back on Earth. Guerrilla tactics, ambushes, striking supply lines, they're second nature now. Zix clenched his jaw tighter, unable to hide his frustration. You're using ancient technology. Your projectiles and explosives are primitive compared to what the Drawn have. How can you possibly hold ground? Brooks looked at the screen with a calm, steady gaze, because it's not always about what you have, it's about how you use it. That answer silenced the room again, and the implications began to sink in. The Council had always measured strength in terms of weapon sophistication, biological enhancements, and numbers. But the humans had introduced a new variable, the mind. Their ability to think, to plan, to adapt, to predict weaknesses, and exploit them quickly, efficiently, relentlessly. A second alert chimed across the room, and a live feed from another outpost lit up the chamber. It showed a different squad of humans maneuvering through dense underbrush, invisible, until they struck drawn patrols were falling into traps. Losing contact with command, unable to regroup and retreating in disarray. Brooks observed the feed alongside the Council, then spoke again. "We've learned to let the terrain do some of the work for us. Especially when we're outnumbered, we use it to isolate and frustrate the enemy. Because once they start reacting instead of acting, the battle shifts." Breen echoed his last words softly, as if trying to understand its full meaning. Flexibility, she repeated the word unfamiliar on her tongue. But now unavoidable, Zix asked about casualties. Brooks responded a few injuries, but no fatalities. The silence in the chamber grew deeper as the reality settled in. The drawn feared across the galaxy for their relentless assaults were being broken. Not with brute force, but with a methodical, unyielding approach from soldiers who didn't wear power armor, who didn't wield advanced energy weapons, who didn't rely on numbers. The Council was watching not just a victory, but a revelation. The humans weren't lucky. They were strategic, precise, and disciplined in ways that were completely unexpected. Their limited technology was not a weakness. It was proof that their tactics, their training, and their understanding of conflict were so advanced they didn't need more. And as more footage played across the screens, more updates confirmed drawn losses and human progress. The fear began to grow not for what the drawn might do, but for what the humans were capable of if they were this effective with so little. What would happen if they truly committed everything to a campaign? What if they set their sights beyond the drawn? Beyond this war, the chamber, once filled with laughter, now carried only the soft sounds of data feeds and the silent recognition that everything they thought they knew about Earth's people had been wrong. The humans were not soft, not naive, not doomed. They were something far more dangerous. They were good at war, and that fact now stared every member of the Galactic Council in the face and dared them to ignore it. The transmission that followed shattered any lingering doubt about what was happening on the ground. A drawn commander, his voice shaky and barely composed, appeared on the Council's emergency communication line. Commander Tack of the Drawn High Command did not speak with the usual arrogance or cold assurance that characterized Drawn leadership. Instead, he looked over his shoulder as if fearing someone or something might interrupt him, and his message was not one of dominance. It was a plea to any Council members receiving this: pull back your forces. You must end this. He said, desperation clear in every word. The chamber fell into a stunned silence. General Zix blinked in disbelief. In all his years of military service, he had never heard a drawn officer plead for anything, let alone surrender. The commander went on to describe the chaos unfolding within their ranks. Human forces were moving like shadows, striking where least expected, dismantling strategies with terrifying precision. His soldiers were deserting. Morale was collapsing. They were losing more than battles. They were losing the will to fight. He admitted that if things continued, there would be nothing left of the drawn forces. The weight of those words pressed heavily on everyone in the chamber. The drawn were feared across the galaxy for their ability to wage war without hesitation or mercy. And now they were crumbling from the inside, not from massive invasions, but from being outmaneuvered, from being broken psychologically and tactically. Not even by superior firepower, but by what seemed like impossibly small groups of soldiers using the terrain, exploiting their weaknesses, outthinking them at every turn. The Council looked to one another, unsure of how to respond. They had spent centuries assuming that the drawn were unbeatable, and now the enemy was asking for mercy. Counselor Breen turned to Zix slowly, her voice quiet but loaded with gravity. "They've broken the drawn," she said, and there was no rebuttal. Zix nodded reluctantly, his gaze distant, as if finally comprehending the full scale of what the humans had done. And yet, despite the victory, the humans continued to press forward. They had not stopped to celebrate or negotiate. They kept moving with the same focused intent that had brought them this far, Captain Brooks appeared again on the Council's main screen, his uniform dirtied from combat, his tone as calm as ever. Rows of human soldiers could be seen behind him, preparing for another push. Zix addressed him directly. "Captain Brooks, we've received communication from the Drawn. They're requesting intervention. They're asking us to stop the fighting. Perhaps it's time we consider a ceasefire." Brooks raised an eyebrow. His response was quiet but firm. A ceasefire? They've had centuries to consider one. Now that we're here, they want to back out. His words were not angry, just tired, disappointed, as if the timing of the request said everything that needed to be said. Counselor Breen interjected, "They are clearly no match for your forces. Perhaps it would be wise to negotiate." Brooks responded, "With a hardened gaze, we've given them plenty of opportunities every time we ambushed a battalion or sabotaged a supply line. We left a clear path for surrender. They refused. They chose this path, and now they want to retreat, only because it's no longer in their favor." The chamber was silent again. No one willing to argue, not because they lacked words, but because deep down they knew he was right. The humans had not struck first, they had responded, and when they committed, they had done so completely now. The Drawn were trying to escape the consequences of a war they had long enforced upon others. Breen asked the question that hung in the air. "Are all humans as skilled in warfare as your team?" Brooks gave a small chuckle. "Not all of us, but enough to ensure that when humanity commits to something, we don't stop halfway." That statement landed heavily on the council delegates. Zix cleared his throat, trying to maintain some semblance of authority, then proposed, "Perhaps we can arrange for the Drawns. Unconditional surrender, a permanent resolution." Brooks didn't hesitate. "We came here to end a war. If surrender is their choice, we'll accept it. But they need to understand we don't tolerate half measures." Breen and Zix activated the communication line, and soon Commander Tech reappeared, paler than before. Barely able to mask his dread when told of the terms, he agreed. "Immediately disarm your forces, withdraw from all occupied zones, surrender every weapon and recognize the Council's authority over the disputed sectors, and know that if you betray these terms, humanity will remember." Tak nodded frantically. "It will be done." The Drawn Empire yields. With that confirmation, the transmission ended, and the council chamber was silent again. But it was not the same silence of earlier arrogance. It was the silence of realization, of witnessing something that fundamentally changed the balance of power across the galaxy. The humans had not just won, they had dismantled the very myth of Drawn invincibility, and they had done it with speed, precision, and a relentless sense of purpose that left everyone shaken. Counselor Breen turned to Brooks once more, her voice more respectful than ever. "Captain, you've not only saved our alliance, you've changed everything." Brooks nodded quietly, his expression devoid of triumph, just a simple statement. "The galaxy is a tough place, Counselor. We just make sure we're tougher." And then he was gone, leaving behind only the echoes of a new reality. Humanity was no longer seen as weak. They were a force that had rewritten the rules of warfare, and the galaxy would never forget it. As the Drawn Empire collapsed under the pressure of the human offensive, the galaxy watched in disbelief. But the most shocking part wasn't just the victory itself. It was how the humans had done it. They hadn't relied on superior technology or overwhelming numbers. They didn't possess biological advantages or ancient alien artifacts. They had used the one thing no one expected: adaptability in battlefield. After battlefield, the humans moved like they had been born for this terrain. They treated unfamiliar planets as if they were their own backyard, manipulating the environment into an extension of their will. Satellite images captured squads weaving through forests, disappearing into undergrowth, setting traps around narrow passes and using the elevation of hills and ridges to rain fire down on disoriented Drawn units. It wasn't brute force that overwhelmed the enemy. It was calculated, unpredictable movement and total mastery of the ground beneath their boots. Lieutenant Cole, in a later report, explained it plainly back on Earth. "We learned early on that turning the environment into an ally gives us an edge, especially when we're outnumbered." The Council had never seen tactics like this. They were used to organized fronts and direct assaults to overwhelming force, meeting resistance with more force. But the humans didn't play by those rules. They didn't even acknowledge them. They approached each Encounter like a game of chess, thinking several steps ahead, moving pieces where they mattered most. Drawing the enemy and frustrating their rhythm, then crushing them with a strike so quick and precise, it felt almost surgical. Counselor Breen reviewed hours of footage showing human soldiers not just surviving, but thriving in battle zones that had been considered unwinnable. Thick jungles, shifting deserts, urban ruins. It didn't matter, the humans adapted to each one like it was second nature there. Training had created soldiers who thought in variables, not absolutes, who improvised when communication failed, and who turned setbacks into bait-drawn squads, were found starved, isolated, cut off from supplies. Not because they had been overrun, but because the humans had used patience and timing to slowly choke them off. Brooks later explained in a debriefing, "We don't always go straight at a target. Sometimes it's smarter to collapse everything around it and let it fall on its own," that mentality confused the Galactic Council, who had long equated warfare with power projection. Yet the humans showed that power could also come from disruption, from making the enemy react instead of act, from making their strength irrelevant. Terrain manipulation was just one part of it. The real power came from what the humans did with it. They didn't just set traps. They forced the enemy to choose between bad options. Every path forward was an ambush, every fallback point compromised. And when the Drawn finally figured out what was happening, it was already too late. The damage had been done. Zix watched one particular feat in silence as human soldiers used a dried riverbed to flank a fortified Drawn position. The move had taken hours of silent movement through rough terrain, but the payoff was devastating. Within minutes, the defenders were routed. Their supplies captured, their commanders eliminated, all without the humans taking a single casualty. When asked how they coordinated such an effort without advanced comms, Brooks simply replied, "We train for silence. We use signals patterns, sometimes even shadows, to communicate. If you wait until you're being shot at to plan, you've already lost." That answer stuck with the Council more than any weapon or statistic. It meant that humans didn't need ideal conditions to succeed. They just needed opportunity. They created their own advantages and turned disadvantages into leverage. Every alien species had its doctrine, its standard response, its playbook. But humans refused to be predictable. They studied the enemy, adapted to their rhythm, and then shattered it. The Drawn had faced centuries of opposition, but none like this. They had expected resistance, not manipulation, confusion, not collapse. What the humans brought wasn't just new. It was incompatible with the Drawn's entire approach to war, and that incompatibility broke them from within. Counselor Breen pointed out something even more chilling during a closed session. They make the battlefield theirs, not through control, but through understanding. They don't impose, they integrate. And once they do, the enemy has nowhere to hide. The rest of the Council sat quietly, recognizing the terrifying truth. Humans weren't winning because they were stronger. They were winning because they made the rules up as they went, and they made sure their enemies never got the chance to catch up. The adaptability that had once been seen as randomness was now understood as intention, pure disciplined, tactical improvisation. Forged from centuries of conflict on their own chaotic planet Earth, had made them problem solvers, survivors. And when those instincts met structure and training, the result was a military force unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Drawn had been the first to learn that lesson, and the Galactic Council knew they would not be the last. The deeper the Galactic Council looked into the reports, the more unsettling the reality became. The humans weren't just winning, they were reshaping the very definition of warfare. Every strategy the Drawn had spent centuries refining was being torn apart, and it wasn't by overwhelming firepower or advanced alien weaponry. It was by something far more insidious and effective: unpredictability. As more transmissions came in, the Council began noticing a disturbing pattern. Drawn troops weren't just being defeated, they were fleeing. Entire squads were abandoning posts, deserting battlefields, and in some cases sabotaging their own equipment just to escape them. Relentless human advance morale across Drawn command had collapsed, and the psychological toll was visible in every intercepted message and fragment of battlefield communication. Commander Tak's plea had not been an isolated incident. He had merely been the first high-ranking officer to put into words what countless soldiers on the ground already knew. They were not equipped to handle this kind of enemy reports. described humans moving like ghosts, setting traps in places no one thought to look. Attacking not when it was convenient, but when it would cause the most confusion and fear. One log mentioned a drawn platoon being led in circles for hours before being picked off one by human snipers hiding in the trees. Others told of booby-trapped supply lines, water sources, poison rations, stolen and replaced with explosive devices that detonated when touched. These weren't tactics of brute force. They were psychological warfare at its purest form, designed not to just win but to dismantle. The will to fight the Drawn had never faced anything like it, and neither had the Council species that had once feared the Drawn now watched with a mixture of awe and horror as their once invincible army crumbled under the pressure of what appeared to be small, under-equipped human teams. Counselor Breen reviewed dozens of hours of footage and data patterns, and one thing became clear: humans were not attacking randomly. Every move was part of a larger plan designed to destabilize not just positions, but minds. They created paranoia within enemy ranks. Every path became suspicious. Every shadow, a threat. Soldiers were found fighting among themselves, suspecting each other of leading the humans. In the pressure and stress fractured their discipline. And once the cracks formed, the humans moved in with surgical precision, eliminating leadership, disrupting communication, and turning retreats into routes. The psychological edge they maintained was unlike anything the Council had documented before, and it raised a chilling question: if humans could break the most feared army in the galaxy with such limited resources, what else were they capable of? The fear was no longer limited to the Drawn. Now members of the Council found themselves wondering what would happen if the humans ever turned their focus inward, if they ever decided that the Alliance itself was a threat. Zix said nothing during most of these meetings. His once booming voice had grown quiet and introspective. He stared long at the data, the Moirayer maps, the casualty counts, and the expressions on the Drawn soldiers' faces. During interrogations, they were not angry. They were scared, truly scared. And for the first time in galactic history, it wasn't because of some terrifying alien monster or doomsday weapon. It was because of humans, because of their creativity, their relentlessness, and their refusal to fight by anyone else's rules. In one closed session, Breen finally voiced the concern. Others were too afraid to say, what if they decide to come for us next? The question hung heavy in the air. No one answered it, not because they had confidence in their defenses, but because they couldn't be sure they'd hold for long against the same tactics that had just dismantled an empire. The unease grew daily. Reports kept pouring in, showing the same story: different planets, different terrains. But the outcome was always the same. Human squads landing, moving swiftly, adapting and dominating. Even the fastest responses from Drawn reinforcements only resulted in greater losses. The humans were always 3 steps ahead, predicting responses before they came, turning strengths into vulnerabilities and using weaknesses as bait. The Drawn leadership had tried everything, shifting their command structure, deploying elite units, unleashing heavy artillery. But nothing worked because the humans didn't react. They anticipated, and that anticipation allowed them to maneuver with a freedom no alien army had ever experienced before. In one captured broadcast, a Drawn field, Commander could be heard screaming in frustration as yet another ambush decimated his unit. He shouted, "They are not fighting us, they are hunting us," and the Council knew he wasn't wrong. That shift in mindset changed everything. Humans didn't see war the way others did. They didn't fight for territory or dominance. They fought to win, and they would do so in whatever way the situation required, with zero regard for tradition or expectation. General Zix finally addressed the Council again after days of silence. "We underestimated them," he said, his voice quiet and bitter. The words tasted sour, but no one argued because they all felt it. Now the humans were not just participants in the war. They were rewriting its rules, and with every victory, they made it clear that this new reality belonged to them. Captain Brooks stood once more before the Galactic Council, his face marked with dust and the fatigue of war, but his voice steady and his eyes sharp behind him. The video feed showed rows of human soldiers preparing to board transport shuttles. The Drawn Empire had officially surrendered, but the Council still needed clarity. still struggled to understand how it had all unraveled so quickly. General Zix addressed Brooks with a tone less commanding and more cautious. "We've received confirmation from the Drawn. They seek ceasefire. They want to negotiate. Perhaps it's time we consider ending this." Brooks raised an eyebrow, his response not laced with hostility, but with a sharp edge. "A ceasefire now they want. To talk now after everything we've done, after every chance we gave them to surrender quietly. They want a conversation when they realize they can't win." Zix shifted, uncomfortably aware that he was no longer speaking from a place of strength. Counselor Breen stepped in, attempting a softer approach. "They are clearly outmatched. Perhaps it would be wise to bring this to a close." Brooks didn't move. His voice remained even but unyielding. "We gave them plenty of chances. Every ambush, every strike left them a way out a path to surrender. They refused again and again. This isn't about pride. This is about commitment. We didn't come here to posture. We came to end the war, and that's exactly what we're doing." The room fell silent once more. The same room that had laughed at the humans, mocked their perceived weakness, now hung on their every word, unsure how to challenge them, unsure if it was even wise to try. Breen asked the question on everyone's mind: are all humans this skilled in warfare? Brooks gave a slight chuckle. "Not all of us, but enough to make sure when humanity commits to something, we finish it, and we finish it completely." That statement resonated in the chamber with a gravity that settled deep in every delegate's thoughts. The council had spent generations defining military excellence through might, technology, and tradition, but the humans had brought something different, something terrifying in its simplicity. They committed fully, and they never stopped. Halfway, Zix cleared his throat, trying to find some measure of control. "Then perhaps we can arrange the terms of the Drawn's unconditional surrender, a permanent resolution." Brooks nodded. "We're open to terms, but let's be clear. If they surrender, it must be complete. Disarm your forces, abandon your occupied territories, pull back your siege engines, and accept Galactic Council oversight. If they violate any of that, humanity will remember the warning wasn't spoken with threat or malice, but with the firm weight of someone who had seen." What half measures led to Commander Tack appeared again on the comms, his face pale, his voice barely holding together. He didn't negotiate, he didn't argue, he simply agreed. "Yes, we surrender fully, unconditionally. Whatever terms humanity requires, we will comply." The words echoed like a final note in the long symphony of destruction that had played out over the last several days. The Drawn Empire had been broken, not just beaten, but shattered strategically, tactically, and psychologically in the galaxy. Had watched every moment Counselor Breen look back at Captain Brooks, her voice softer now, more reverent than questioning. "Captain, you've not only saved our alliance, you've shown us a new way to fight." Brooks shook his head slowly. "We didn't do this to make a point. We did this because it had to be done. But if there's one thing you take away, it's that the galaxy doesn't respond to power alone. It responds to will. And we don't back down when we start something." The screen went dark, and the council sat in silence, a silence filled with realization and respect, and something else, the fear of what could happen if that will ever turned against them. The Drawn Empire's surrender marked more than the end of a war. It marked the beginning of a new era, one where Earth's people no longer sat at the edge of galactic affairs, but stood firmly in the center. Not because they demanded it, but because they had earned it. The humans had redefined warfare not through superiority, but through intention. They had proven that, even without the best tools or the strongest bodies, what mattered most was resolve and the willingness to do what others wouldn't. The council members reviewed the final reports, each one a testament to precision and relentlessness the humans had won by treating war not as spectacle or tradition, but as a problem to be solved one step at a time, one decision at a time, and they had solved it thoroughly. The Drawn had never seen it coming, and now the council understood, neither had they. The lesson was clear. Never underestimate a species that refuses to quit, that learns, adapts, and fights with purpose. And in that chamber filled with some of the most powerful leaders in the galaxy, not one dared to speak against that truth. Because in the end, they had all witnessed it firsthand. What humanity lacked in appearance, they made up for in execution, and that changed everything forever. The days following the surrender of the Drawn Empire were marked by a strange quiet across the galaxy. Not a silence of peace, but of recalibration, as species everywhere tried to understand what had just unfolded. The most feared military force in recent memory had not only been defeated, but had been undone, dismantled by a species that most in the Galactic Council had once dismissed as irrelevant, and now everywhere the same question whispered through star systems. How did the humans do it? How did they take down an empire in days? Not months, not years, but days. Reports continued to pour in from every front confirming that human forces were still active, not out of necessity, but as part of their cleanup, ensuring that no rogue drawn elements remained. They weren't looting. They weren't claiming territory. They were stabilizing the regions they had just fought through, restoring order and removing threats as if this had been part of their plan all along. Counselor Breen monitored the aftermath from her observation chamber, studying human patterns and deployments, trying to understand how a civilization so young in galactic terms had managed to execute one of the most effective military campaigns in known history. She reviewed footage of soldiers conducting operations with a level of calm and coordination that bordered on unnerving. Small squads worked with purpose, reclaiming areas, setting up temporary relief points. Gathering intelligence and moving on, they carried themselves not like conquerors but like professionals. They had a job to finish, and they were doing it with precision. And Restraint General Zix remained in a state of contemplative silence. The same warrior who once scoffed at the mention of human involvement now avoided making eye contact with their representatives. Each new update chipped away at his pride, not because the humans had embarrassed him, but because he now realized how blind he had been. The reports showed no signs of excess, no chaos, no disorder, just one mission after another completed with startling efficiency. And then came the cultural shock and the realization that the humans had not done this for glory or expansion. They had done it because it needed to be done, because a threat had emerged and someone had to deal with it. And once they committed fully. No delays, no excuses, no fear. One council delegate compared it to a force of nature, quiet, focused, and completely unstoppable. Breen put it differently during a classified session. They fight like they have already accepted every possible outcome, and that makes them terrifying. It wasn't just how they fought, it was why the humans brought with them a mindset that the council was unfamiliar with. They did not see war as a proving ground or a political tool. They saw it as a necessity, something ugly to be done swiftly and completely to prevent greater suffering, and when they engaged, they didn't drag it out. They made sure it ended and ended on their terms in the aftermath of victory. They did not boast, they did not parade through the stars, demanding tribute. Instead, they met with council representatives, reviewed the surrender terms, enforced disarmament, and moved on. They didn't want control, they wanted resolution, and that made them even more dangerous because it meant their strength wasn't tied to ego, it was tied to purpose. Captain Brooks appeared once more before the council, not to celebrate, but to provide a final report. His demeanor remained unchanged, calm, serious, resolute. He detailed the final stages of the campaign, including the full withdrawal of drawn forces from occupied territories, the destruction of siege engines, the recovery of stolen resources, and the re-establishment of council authority over disputed systems. Not one drawn commander resisted the orders. Not after what they had seen, not after what the humans had shown them, Counselor Breen asked quietly. Was there ever a moment you thought this wouldn't work? Brooks nodded. Of course, but you don't stop because of doubt. You keep moving, you adapt, you finish. And that one word echoed again. Finish it had become the theme of the human involvement. They didn't just fight, they finished everything they started, and in doing so they forced everyone else to reconsider how war was measured no longer by size or strength, or even tradition, but by resolve. The humans had set a new standard, one that would ripple across civilizations and force every military doctrine to evolve. Those who once viewed humanity as soft now whispered about them with respect, and even fear stories spread quickly about squads of Earthborn soldiers appearing out of nowhere, ending battles before they even began, units that operated like ghosts and disappeared just as quickly, leaving only silence and cleared zones behind. Zix listened to one such report and said nothing. The man who once laughed at their involvement now recorded every word, every detail. Not out of obligation, but because deep down he knew the galaxy would never be the same. The humans had earned a reputation, not by demanding it, but by proving it they had turned. War into something precise, measured, calculated, and final. And now the galaxy would have to adjust because Earth was no longer on the fringes of interstellar relevance. It was at the center not by conquest but by merit. And in a universe that respected power, nothing spoke louder than a war ended in days by a force that no one saw coming. As the final reports rolled in, the Galactic Council reviewed the full extent of what had just occurred across the war fronts. Every planet once under siege by the Ma'ar drawn now stood clear of their military assets, dismantled their supply routes, severed and their morale in ruins. Not by fleets of dreadnoughts or armies numbering in the millions, but by small, coordinated units of human soldiers who had moved like shadows, struck like lightning, and disappeared before the enemy could react. It wasn't luck and it wasn't brute force. It was discipline, focus, and a complete commitment to every objective set before them. Lieutenant Cole submitted his last communication from the northern perimeter, standing atop a ridge overlooking a drawn war camp. Now abandoned his uniform, worn his expression calm and clear. "We've wrapped up operations here, sir," he said. "We've confiscated their remaining stockpiles, redirected survivors toward Council checkpoints, and ensured no resistance cells remain. We'll be heading home soon." General Zix, who once dismissed the humans, now listened with silent reverence, unable to deny the power and efficiency these Earthborn warriors had demonstrated. Counselor Breen stood beside him, quietly watching the data stream across the holoscreens. Drawn losses were staggering, not just in numbers, but in spirit. Entire legions surrendered without resistance. Officers once feared throughout the galaxy now handed over weapons and bowed their heads, not out of obligation, but because their will had been broken. The realization spread across the stars. Humanity was not a curiosity or a fluke. They were a force shaped not just by strength, but by necessity, forged through centuries of conflict on a planet that never offered peace. Easily, Earth had been a battlefield long before it looked to the stars. War had taught humans lessons no academy could replicate. It taught them improvisation, taught them how to endure without comfort, how to strike without warning, how to adapt when plans failed, how to move when orders fell silent, and most of all, how to finish what they started in the final council debrief. Captain Brooks addressed the delegates one last time, his voices measured as ever. The drawn chose war, and we answered. We didn't come here for conquest. We came to end what they started, and we made sure it ended properly. Now that it has, we hope this galaxy sees war differently. Zix finally spoke then, not as a superior, not as a general, but as a witness. We did not believe in you, and we were wrong. You didn't just defeat the drawn. You changed how we understand conflict. Breen followed his words with a question, soft but heavy with meaning. "Captain, what happens if Earth is ever seen as a threat?" Brooks held her gaze and said quietly, "Then we hope the galaxy remembers how we offered peace first before we ever raised a weapon." Silence filled the chamber, and in that silence, every leader understood the weight of what had passed. Humanity had not just fought a war. They had revealed a truth that shook assumptions about power and legacy and superiority. They had reminded the galaxy that the strength of a people cannot be measured in their appearance or their resources alone, but in their spirit, in their resolve, and in their refusal to surrender to fear. In many ways, it was not just the drawn empire that had fallen. It was the old way of thinking, the idea that might was muscle, that victory was noise, that war was a matter of who had the bigger weapon the humans had shown, that clarity of purpose, adaptability in motion, and total commitment to finishing the mission were more decisive than any fleet or fortress. And maybe that was the lesson that would echo far beyond this campaign into the hearts of every leader, every soldier, and every world watching from a distance. Earth had reminded the galaxy of something simple but forgotten, that wars are not won by those who yell the loudest, but by those who listen, who learn, and who act with resolve. And when they act, they do not hesitate. They do not falter and they do not stop halfway until the mission is complete. In a universe filled with ancient empires and towering legacies, the youngest species among them had stood up when it mattered and proved that sometimes the ones you overlook are the ones who change everything. And in our own world, in our own time, perhaps we can take something from this tale. Because strength isn't just a matter of power, it's the courage to step forward when everyone else steps back, the patience to study before striking, and the wisdom to end what must be ended, not for glory, but for peace. It's a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, resolve can be sharper than steel and calm more devastating than rage. And that when ordinary people choose to rise, they can shape the future, not through domination, but through discipline, not through fear, but through focus. And that is the quiet power that changes worlds.